Hey listeners, Nathan here. I just wanted to pipe in before the episode got started to let you know that while this is structured like a mini-sode, it's a lot longer than a mini-sode, and that's because I realized with people going into quarantine over the coronavirus, they're going to be dealing with a lot of cabin fever. So I went to the Monster Island Board of Directors and I advocated hard to tell them, you have to let me make a longer episode so that people have some quality entertainment to get through this. And after a lot of persuasion, they were kind enough to let me do it. So I hope you enjoy. Live from Ogasawara, this is the Monster Island Film Vault, Episode 15, Battle in Outer Space. Hello, kaiju lovers, and welcome to the Monster Island Film Vault, a podcast seeking entertainment and enlightenment through tokusatsu. I am your host, the curator of the vault, Nathan Marchand. But unlike in most minisodes, although this won't be terribly mini, I'll get to that in a second. Joining me today for this episode is none other than the man behind the Earth Destruction Directive himself, Luke Jaconetti.
Hey, Nathan, thank you very much for having me here on Monster Island. I'm really excited to be here, really excited to talk about the battle in outer space. Very exciting time.
Well, yeah, it's especially exciting now because I can't begin to tell you how much I had to fight to let the Monster Island Board of Directors allow you onto the island, because this whole coronavirus thing is getting so crazy now that they want to put the island in quarantine. And I said, not before I have Luke here.
Well, and your efforts are appreciated. I can tell you that on my side of it, I don't know if you ever saw these documents or not, but my boss is Mr. Dufo D'Amonzo of Milan, Italy. And, you know, Italy is in mid-dire straits right now. I'm not going to mince words. So they didn't want, the office wouldn't want to clear anything, because their attitude is, well, if we can't travel, you guys can't travel. Basically, and I worked this out with the attorneys, and there was memos flying back and forth between the board of directors and our attorneys at D'Amonzo. And basically what happened is, so apparently, due to the vagaries of international maritime law, evidently, Signore D'Amonzo owns an island off the coast of, I guess it's south of Sardinia in the Mediterranean Sea.
Really?
And this yes, and this island, apparently, because of the nature of its extradition rules, that's where Jimmy came and picked me up. So I was able to get a flight, because you can't fly to Europe now, right? Well, this island is not in Europe. So I was able to get a flight to this island. I don't know how, considering I'm not sure what the name of the island is, how we got a flight plan. But D'Amonzo got me a jet there, and then Jimmy came in the SPIP and picked me up, and we did the whole VTOL thing over to Ogasawara. So that's how we're here.
Really?
I'm not sure how I'm getting back. Even if I get off the island, I'm not sure if we can get back to D'Amonzo's island. And if I do that, how I'm getting back to the States. I got nothing right now. I'm on a wing and a prayer. So
literally?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, it's a good sign when the attorneys, first off, they only speak Italian. They've got to have a translator there. My Italian, I can speak a few phrases. But at the end, they're like, oh, by the way, you never saw me. It's like, oh, okay. So not sure what to make of that. But hey, D'Amonzo's taken care of me for nearly a decade. Who am I to question his judgment, right?
Yeah. Good job on that, Jimmy. I appreciate the use of the loopholes. Although, where the heck were you hiding the SPIP? I always say SPIP. I don't say SPIP. But where the heck were you hiding that? I've been in your garage. Where was that? Really? It was in the back? You have a secret compartment in your garage? Do I want to know what else is back there?
Well, I can give you a hint of what's back there.
Tell me off the air, because I would be a little bit concerned that the wrong people would hear this. Unfortunately, there aren't very many people here on the island to hear our live broadcast. So most of this is going to end up in the podcast version of the episode.
Well, hey, that happens. These are strange days that we live in. I mean, we don't have a radioactive dust cloud over New Guinea or anything yet, but these are strange days.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a passage someplace in Nostradamus mentions something about a crowned virus, I think, of or something like that. But that's a film for another day. Today, you and I, because you requested this, you specifically requested to come on the show to talk about an alien invasion film. And I said, well, you know what, good sir? You are in luck. There is one on the docket. Several, but this was the first one that came up. Today, we will be talking about the movie that everybody not in the Three Treasures was working on that year.
Yeah. Yeah. So Battle in Outer Space, it's odd because, nowadays, not like in hallowed antiquity, long ago before the last great ice age, this is a movie that now is finally getting some exposure. This movie never got a VHS release in the U.S. It was the only one. Yes, Columbia Pictures made 3 films in collaboration with Toho. They made The H-Man, then they made Battle in Outer Space, and then they made Mothra. And The H-Man and Mothra were pretty easily found on VHS, but Battle in Outer Space wasn't. I want to say it wasn't until it was released on DVD on the Icons of Sci-Fi Toho collection.
And that is the copy that I have.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it's a wonderful set. It's still available out there on DVD. Just a great set of those 3 movies together.
And now Mill Creek's re-releasing it in a couple of months.
Yes, and what's amusing is that they did the Blu-ray Steelbook of Mothra. And I remember in the back of my head, just that little tickler saying, I wonder if they're going to do the other 2, because if they've got the license from Columbia, they can get the other 2, I'm sure. And so sure enough, Battle in Outer Space and The H-Man coming on a double feature Blu-ray a few months down the line as we are here on the island today.
Yes,
so,
which actually makes this episode weirdly timely. That was not planned.
Isn't it? Isn't it though? It's almost as if we planned this stuff out sometime.
Well, yeah, I mean, but I'll chuck it up to the same thing happened when this was funny with the Three Treasures episode. Yeah, that's episode 13, and according to Japanese legend, Yamato Takeru, the hero in that film, was the 13th emperor of Japan. So,
very good.
Well, no wonder he had such horrible luck in that movie.
Yeah, exactly. Didn't work out so hot for him, but in any event, Battle in Outer Space, for me, has a very strange origin because I first became aware of this movie not from the film itself, not from reading about the film in a book or anything like that. When I was a kid, my father had, my dad is real big into genre movies also.
Yes, I've heard your dad on your brother's podcast.
Yes. My dad and my brother. Well, my brother's show is Bots, Bugs, and Babes, and my dad is a very frequent, semi-permanent co-host on that show. My father is responsible for my brother and I being into genre films. He's responsible for me being a Godzilla fan because of the stuff that he showed me when I was a kid. I've told this story on Earth Destruction Directive many times. First Godzilla movie I ever saw was Godzilla King of the Monsters when I was about 4. And that was on a VHS tape along with Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, Rodan, and what was then known as Godzilla vs. Monster Zero. So there was always genre stuff in the house, right? And Dad had several books of classic sci-fi movie posters where it was just page after page of reproductions of posters and lobby cards for all these different sci-fi movies. So my first exposure to Battle in Outer Space was in one of those books that showed all of the U.S. lobby cards for Battle in Outer Space. And listeners, if you're not familiar with a lobby card, what used to be when you go to the theater, in addition to just the posters being in the lobby, they would have these lobby cards that were smaller than a poster. They were about a half sheet size. They were usually landscape oriented rather than portrait oriented. They'd have the title of the film and the cast and stuff, but then they'd have a actual scene from the film or something that looks like a scene from the film. They might have a picture of the cast or a picture of some exciting sequence from the movie. The ones for Battle in Outer Space are all of just outer space battles. They show the satellite, they show the UFOs, they show the fighters, and they are painted over the image. So it's like the typical looking Toho publicity photo from this era, from the 50s and 60s. But it looked fascinating. It looked utterly fascinating to me. And it's such a straightforward title, The Battle in Outer Space.
It's so straightforward. It's so straightforward. It's almost boring.
Right.
It almost sounds generic, but I can tell you from my studies of literature, because you were an engineer, I was an English major, and the English and writing. But one of the things I can tell you from studying particularly 19th century naturalist literature is they liked titles like that, these really straightforward, almost generic sounding titles. A famous example that unfortunately I forget the author's name. You can look that up for me, Jimmy. You had An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge.
Yes. You know, it's funny because sometimes with Japanese titles, you get the hyperbolic description.
Oh, yes.
One of my personal favorites is for the movie we know here in the West as Godzilla is the Sea Monster. Godzilla, Mothra, Ibra, Big Duel in the North Sea, which is I just love that title for whatever reason. And of course...
It was also called at one point, the working title for it was Operation Robinson Crusoe.
Yeah. Well, that's when your boy Kong was still in it. It was Operation Robinson Crusoe.
Yeah.
Or, of course, the most overdramatic Japanese title, my personal favorite. Again, the movie we just called GMK here in the States.
Oh, geez.
Gojira, Mothra, Kingu Ghidorah, Dai Kaiju, Shoshingeki.
Yes.
But in any event, Battle in Outer Space, our British listeners might say it does what it says on the tin. It says Battle in Outer Space, and that's what we get. But that was my introduction, and it was a number of years before I saw this movie. The knock I'd always heard on it was that it's like the Mysterians, but it's not as good.
Which is interesting, because Jimmy has been reminding me of this for the last couple of months, ever since I talked about the Mysterians. This was actually originally supposed to be a sequel to the Mysterians. Then, weirdly enough, there's another movie that he has tremendous connection to. I'll leave it at that. Yep. That was originally supposed to be a sequel to Battle in Outer Space, so we have this pseudo-trilogy.
Yes.
Because there are two characters in this movie who have the same names as characters from the Mysterians as a holdover from the fact that it was originally intended to be a sequel.
Right. And thematically, obviously, the films are very similar. They're both alien invasion movies. You could also make the connection that, the technology that had to be developed during the course of the story of the Mysterians is why, I want to say the Mysterians, it takes place in the year it was made, right? It takes place in 1957?
Actually, according to Stuart Galbraith in one of his books, the movie is supposed to take place in 1965. And I'd like to know where he got that information, because I never saw anything in the movie that indicated that.
Yeah, Battle in Outer Space clearly states it takes place in 1965. So I had always assumed that the implication being that, okay, Earth repelled this attack from the Mysterians a few years earlier. The technology that was developed, including, the Marker Light cannon and so forth, that was why they have this advanced technology now in 1965, only a scant 6 years in the future from when Battle in Outer Space was produced. So again, it's definitely a loose trilogy. It falls into those odd Toho, I say odd to a lot of Western fans because they're Toho movies that don't have a monster in them.
Yeah, well, the Mysterians does, and it
Kinda does.
With Mogura. Yeah. Mogura gets kaiju fans to watch the Mysterians. You don't have anything like that in here. I'm actually, now that I think about it, I'm mildly surprised that didn't happen, considering Tanaka's penchant for shoehorning monsters into everything.
Right.
With
we'd see
mixed results. I mean, Mogura works fine in the Mysterians, and I would even say that Manda, however you want to say it, in Atragon. Actually, I think Manda works tremendously well in Atragon. Then there's that stupid walrus in Gorath.
But, I was going to say, yes.
That's a story for another day. That's another episode.
The thing with Manda, it's like he has such an iconic appearance, again, being the Chinese-style dragon and then wrapping himself around Gotenko and all that. But Battle in Outer Space, like I said, I've always heard it compared to the Mysterians. So rewatching it here was very interesting to me because it had been a few years since I had previously watched it, and I enjoyed it, but I didn't remember a lot of it. So I really enjoyed sitting down with you to watch it critically, to really make notes on it and address it, because there's a lot going on here. It advances a lot of the themes of the Mysterians, but this film doesn't get credit for some of what would become tropes that Toho would mine for years after this are on display in this movie. And I have like a list of things that show up in their later space operas.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot that we could go over with that. I realize that we're a good ways into the episode already, but I should probably provide at least a brief plot description, since that's what I usually do in these shorter episodes. I don't have Jimmy's entertaining info dump this time around. He only does those for the big discussion episodes, especially now that we just wrapped up the main leg of the Kong quest. And we're now having to wait for Godzilla vs. Kong to come out to finish it because, the release date keeps getting moved around. My gosh, it'll probably get moved around again at this rate.
Yeah.
I'm starting to wonder if Godzilla vs. Kong is just some bizarre fever dream that we're all having at the same time as a fandom. But anyway, all that to say, did you have something to add to that?
All I was going to say is weirder things have happened. So,
Yeah. But anyway, as you mentioned, it's an alien invasion story. Pretty much what happens is the aliens show up, attack a space station, the world comes together and realizes we need to do something to respond to this. So they put a big team together on 2 ships, the SPIP, SPIP, whatever you want to call it, make 2 of them, send them up to the moon, and they try to do some recon work with the aliens, and they find out that ultimately, yes, the aliens' goal is to, you guessed it, take over the world.
Of course!
Jimmy, what did I tell you about letting M. Bison on the island? Get that dictator out of here before he, mind controls Kong or something. We've been through this. There are strict guidelines against mind controlling the kaiju. We have bad experiences with mind control kaiju, okay? Jeez.
All I can say is, quick, change the channel.
Yes. Quick, change the channel. Thankfully, Zangief got a better job. Anyway, so they go there, they find their base, they attack the base, take out the base, and they manage to escape back to Earth. And then they find out, their intentions are hostile and need to do something to respond. They build some super slick rocket fighters, one of which I am proud to say Jimmy does have in his garage. That thing is ancient. I am astonished it even still works. But he's got one of them. Starting to wonder how he's doing this, but sometimes I just don't ask questions. And then the aliens launch one more attack and it gets repelled. So it's a pretty standard alien invasion story. It's a very plot-driven story. Every time I've watched it, I've realized just how plot-driven it is, which is a little bit astonishing. I know a lot of people compare this to The Mysterians, obviously, because it was at one time intended to be a sequel. But The Mysterians was written by Takeshi Kimura, and this one was written by Shinichi Sekizawa. In fact, I'm guessing it had to have been, probably may have only been maybe his second tokusatsu script, because he had just started working for Toho the year before with Varan. That was his first. I have to bring it up because I'm a writer myself, and I always talk about the screenwriters because the screenwriters don't get enough credit, especially from the Showa era, which is why me and Daniel Demana did a panel presentation on Takeshi Kimura, Shinichi Sekizawa, because they need to be talked about more. So I will champion these guys all the time as much as I can. This film felt less like a typical Sekizawa script, and it felt more like a Kimura script because I don't want to say the characters are inconsequential, but this is not a film about the characters. We have some nice character moments. Iwamura, Yoshio Shuchiya in this. There's some great moments with him. He's probably the most interesting character out of everybody. But other than that, no one else is necessarily memorable in this because it's more about the plot. It's about the world coming together and repelling a threat. It's kind of a weird movie because it's like the stuff in the middle is bookended by all of the UN stuff with the representatives coming together and figuring out what to do.
Yeah, the story goes that Columbia worked with Toho on the H-Man in order to make it viable to be released here in the United States. And that after the success of the H-Man, they basically co-produced Battle in Outer Space and then Mothra, which is one of the reasons that we see larger casts, more special effects, brighter color, just more ambitious in general than the films that had come immediately before, specifically Battle in Outer Space and Mothra. So thinking like even more so than the Mysterians and Rodan, Varan, these are more ambitious films. Well, again, whether you like them or not, just from a production standpoint. So in a lot of ways, Battle in Outer Space strikes me as a kind of a Western style movie in that it is so plot driven. It reminds me of a Western-style alien invasion movie. It does have some of the hallmarks that we associate with Japanese films. You talk about the UN stuff. There are several instances in this film. I've got just a couple of this noted where there are, it's showing the international scope right at the beginning when all the strange goings on are happening, which will later get mirrored in Atragon a few years down the road. Mm-hmm. We get the international news broadcast all across the world. There's a great bit, or one of the early UN scenes where one of the delegates says, "So Japan's theory may help."
Yes.
And so there's much like you talked about on the Mysterians, this idea of Japan being part of the world stage, not being either a pariah, but also not being, we're the ones that are going to solve everything, being a team player. I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of Nimawashi, the aligning of the roots.
Okay.
For listeners that may not be familiar with that, Nimawashi is a Japanese concept about cooperation and working together. The way that it was explained to me several years ago, many years ago now, I was working a project for, as Nathan said, I'm an engineer, I'm a project engineer, so I work on project-based work. We were doing a project for a very large Japanese firm. It's one you've heard of, and I'll leave it at that. Mm-hmm. And so we actually took classes on how to work effectively with a Japanese client, because Japanese clients have different expectations than an American client or even a European client. And one of the concepts that was explained was Nimawashi. And the way that Nimawashi was explained was, let's say that you've got a major decision on a project and you have a meeting scheduled for the end of the month where you're going to discuss this major change and make a decision. Nimawashi is the idea that before the meeting, you go around and get all the major players to buy in and cooperate and get their agreement to the decision. And then at the meeting, you simply announce the decision. So it's the idea that you align the roots. You make sure that everyone is okay and everyone is willing to cooperate and work together. It's culturally speaking, I've read in numerous places the idea that cooperation has such a strong emphasis in Japanese, modern, especially Japanese culture, just because you have such a large amount of people living in such a relatively small space that you have to cooperate and get along if the culture and the society are going to function properly. So I always like seeing this idea that Japan is a team player, that they're seen as, we're cooperating with the East, we're cooperating with the West. We are here to help. We are an international country, and we work for the benefit of the entire human race. That is one of the cornerstones of the Showa era, and it's perfectly displayed here.
Yes, which is one of the things that astonishes me a little bit. I read in the Honda biography that Godacheski and Rifle just put out a year or so ago that I thought this was such a strange statement. They actually felt like because the special effects take up so much time in this, that it doesn't really feel like an Ashura Honda movie. And I'm wondering where that came from, because I do see Ashura Honda in this. And the place where it's most directly expressed is exactly what you're talking about, the international cooperation. I mean, we have two teams of astronauts that are made up of both Americans and Japanese coming together to go to the moon and do recon on these aliens, the Natal, that's what they're called. I think that's how you pronounce it. And putting a fourth right there, it's an expression of the alliance that had just been formed between the United States and Japan, and the connections that the countries had at that point, which I think is impressive when you're looking at this, and it's only a decade and a half after World War II, the amount of cooperation that's going on there. But you also see it in those UN scenes. My gosh, just like in the Mysterians, the Soviet Union is putting the Cold War aside and and actually helping everybody. I mean, this is at a year when you had Khrushchev making his infamous speech in the UN where he's saying, "We will bury you." I mean,
right.
So it's astonishing. It's a very idealistic portrait of the world. And that's what I come to expect from Honda. Honda was very much an idealist, despite all of his experiences in the war. And I think that's why all of us as kaiju and tokusatsu fans love his work so much.
Mm-hmm. But I will say that you talked about this not feeling like a Sekizawa script. To me, one of the strengths of the Godzilla series as we get into the 60s is the push and pull between Honda and Sekizawa, because they had different backgrounds. They both served in the war, but I've always read that one of the reasons that so many of Sekizawa's films are set on islands is that he basically went from island to island and really grew to hate islands. And so that's why there's so many.
And I read someplace that Sakazawa had quote unquote weird experiences on islands, but it was never elaborated more than that. So I'm thinking, was there red berry juice involved?
Yes. There had some kind of strange juice on some island in the Pacific. He had a weird experience.
He was just there. Some native girl went up to him and said, like, here, try this. It's the good stuff.
Yes. But in this, you don't get a lot of more of the tropes that we'd see in some of Sakazawa's scripts. Obviously, ones like the island or the island native peoples or strange juices or stuff like that. But this is a little more straightforward in its storytelling. I think a lot of that may have to do with the influence of Columbia. The idea that this is a movie, like I said, it reminds me a lot of a more Western-style movie. Henry G. Saperstein would say this a few years down the road with Monster Zero, and Monster Zero is another movie that owes a lot to
Oh
this
my
movie.
gosh, it owes so much.
There's so much of this, even down to like individual shots in this movie are replicated in Monster Zero.
Oh, yes.
Saperstein had said with Monster Zero, is like these Japanese movies, they always want to talk at the beginning. Let's put some action at the beginning.
Yeah, and this movie definitely starts with a bang. You start the movie up and suddenly, with no context given, it's just alien spaceships attacking a space station and blowing up the space station.
So yeah, I mean, yeah, you're right. It starts right out of the bat with this attack on this satellite and the satellite defending itself back and forth. So immediately you're drawn into this because we know that the satellite is an Earth satellite because we see the crew. And the crew are clearly Earthlings and they're speaking Japanese and they're trying to radio for assistance. So immediately you get brought into this action. And what's great about this is this scene transitions to the opening credits, which again, Monster Zero owes its opening credits to this. But the music, the main theme.
My gosh.
One of the just absolute best, I would say one-off themes, except it does get reused almost 15 years down the road. So most Daikaiju fans will know this as, this is the main title to Godzilla vs. Gigan.
Yep, that was me.
Like,
the first time I watched this movie. I mean, I already knew the score in Gigan was stock music that they just recycled. So,
right.
But I watched Gigan so much as this kaiju-loving teen. And then when I finally saw Battle in Outer Space, it was a little bit surreal. I was like, wait a minute. I'm picturing Gigan opening titles, and it's originally from here. This is weird.
Yeah.
And I've read that it was also that Ifukube also repurposed this for Terror of Mechagodzilla, if I remember correctly. Although that was a little harder for me to detect. So obviously he reworked it enough that it was different. But still, the music in this is fantastic. I will grant you that. This has one heck of a rousing score, I have to say. Mm-hmm. The whole movie. But those opening titles are just incredible with what they're doing because it opens with such energy. But you mentioned that this reminded you a lot of a Western film, and it did for me as well. For what I've read, there's supposed to be nods in this to Earth versus the Flying Saucer and Destination Moon. I'm not exactly sure what those nods are, but that's what I have read. I've seen Earth versus the Flying Saucer, although it's been a while, so I'm not sure quite where those come from.
What I could think for Earth versus the Flying Saucers, there's two things that spring to mind. The voices of the Natal.
Oh, yes.
In Earth versus the Flying Saucers, actually, this is funny because on Earth Destruction Directive, the intro, the voice of the aliens in the intro to my show is inspired directly from the voice of the aliens in Earth versus the Flying Saucer.
I had wondered.
Yeah, because they wear the helmets and it makes their voice that kind of hollow, tinny sound. So that, I think, is part of it. Also, the last act of Earth versus the Flying Saucers features the Flying Saucers attacking Washington, D.C., and a lot of monuments in Washington, D.C. being destroyed.
That makes sense.
So one could say, well, that could be a nod here where in the last reel, the Natal actually make it onto Earth and they do some bad stuff to Tokyo.
And to New York and to the Golden Gate Bridge. What is it with movies? And I used to think this was more of a modern thing because there's been this weird influx of Hollywood movies that want to destroy the Golden Gate Bridge. I've just been noticing. But I guess it's even back then, Tsuburaya looked at pictures or something and said, hey, why don't we destroy that?
I think part of it is, and this is going to sound like I'm dunking on Los Angeles, and I'm not. I'm absolutely not dunking on the city of Los Angeles. New York has a lot of recognizable large landmarks. Washington, D.C. has a lot of recognizable large landmarks. Chicago has the former Sears Tower, as a recognizable landmark. Even Seattle has, the Space Needle. Los Angeles and San Francisco. San Francisco has a few, but the Golden Gate Bridge is the most recognizable icon of the major cities in California. I'm reminded of, the Irwin Allen movie Earthquake, where they destroy Los Angeles. And it's like, if you're not from Los Angeles, a lot of these locales don't mean anything just because they don't have that kind of, mythic sort of status like the Empire State Building or even, the Brooklyn Bridge, the George Washington Bridge. So that's why you destroy the Golden Gate Bridge. You want to destroy something on the West Coast. That's the recognizable icon.
That is true.
And I say this as someone who, for business, traveled to San Francisco about 6 times in the course of last year of 2019. We never drove on the Golden Gate Bridge. We always drove on the Bay Bridge. But once you get over the Bay Bridge to the other side of the bay and you can see the Golden Gate Bridge, it is beautiful to look at. So I can understand a filmmaker's desire to destroy it.
Yeah. That's a great way to put it. That is a beautiful bridge. We're going to destroy it.
In the immortal words of Ultra Magnus, it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Okay, give me the bomb.
Yeah, the closest I've ever come to the Golden Gate Bridge is I've been to Mackinac Island in Michigan for the Mackinac Bridge, which is also a suspension bridge. It's pretty cool. But I also noticed a thematic connection between this and Western films. It's particularly notable because I think this is the first time, because the Mysterians didn't do this. This is the first time that Toho has had, as far as I know, an alien race that employed mind control. Because we have Iwamura, Yoshio Tsuchiya in this. As I mentioned before, he's the most interesting character, in large part because he's one of these scientists on the spaceship team who, it sounds like the Natal perform a bizarre surgery on him and essentially implant a bit of themselves in his brain, which allows them to order him around. Now, the control is not absolute. It's not like the infamous alien disco space nuns that we dealt with here on Monster Island 20 years ago. That's what we call them now. They're the disco space nuns. It's kind of like Voldemort. You never refer to him by name. But it wasn't absolute. He was able to resist, and it definitely seemed like there was a lot of resistance going on. They were using him to sabotage the ship and do all kinds of unpleasant things throughout the course of the middle portion of the movie. And I was thinking of how in American science fiction films, particularly the alien films, like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, for example, those were heavily influenced by the Red Scare. The idea that if there was to be an invasion by the Soviets on the United States, it would not be a traditional invasion. It would be accomplished through subterfuge. They would infiltrate the country and change people's minds to not think like Americans anymore, to think like communists. And you see that reflected in a lot of science fiction films from the 50s in the United States. It played on that anxiety, which is one of the things I find interesting in this because it doesn't quite fit the mold for what we see in certainly the Mysterians, but also with a lot of the aliens that came after this. I mean, other than the aforementioned disco space nuns, if they're using mind control, they're mind controlling the monsters. They're not usually mind controlling people. Right. Which I find fascinating, particularly because I read a chapter in a book called The Kaiju Film by Jason Barr, and I reread it in anticipation of this discussion, where he did a whole thing talking about the Japanese attitudes with these aliens. He was talking specifically with Godzilla films, and how, if you stop and think about it, if we're already talking about these 50s films in the United States being reflections of the anxieties of the United States at that time with the Red Scare, he argued, and I don't take his argument as far as he does, but I do see what he's talking about. There's only ever been one country that ever successfully invaded Japan. That was the U.S. So his argument was that the aliens in these movies are anti-American commentaries. To which I responded when I read that as, are you trying to make me hate these movies? Well, but I don't think that's entirely true. I think they're certainly inspired by that, but I don't think they're meant to be anti-American commentary so much as that's the part of the well of their own history and experience that they are pulling from to make these.
Right.
because the alien invaders in these Japanese films don't exactly act like the ones you would see in American films, for sure.
No. In fact, I've read Barr's book as well, and I think there is something to that. I don't know that I take it to the level that his argument is, but one thing that's in this film that is also, again, recycled in Monster Zero, talking about how the invaders behave, the Natal specifically say Earth will become a colony.
Yes.
And then the
that is very interesting
the controller,
language.
Yeah, the controller says the exact same thing, that Earth will become a colony of Planet X. So the idea of, again, to use the argument that the Americans came in and want to make Japan a colony, there was that sentiment, that anti-American resentment that that's what America wanted to do. I don't know that the United States really wanted Japan to be a colony so much as a really nice military base.
Yes.
Which is much the same that we did in Germany, to be honest. It's like, the Germans thought they were getting a country. America saw, hey, this is a great base we can have to fight the Soviets in.
Yep.
So there is certainly something to that. And I think, again, it is part of that idea that this is when the country was invaded by an exterior force and made to change who they are, what their identity was, good, bad, or otherwise, that was the intention. So I do think there is something to that.
Yeah. And I was
again,
particularly... Oh, sorry, you go.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I was particularly struck watching the film with that in mind, because when you get to that one point, and I just thought this was interesting, when the Natal are threatening the crew and they're telling them that they have to stop what they're doing by, I think what they said, like by the count of 10, or they would kill them all. And it's just this disembodied voice coming from their base. And then they start counting, not in Japanese. They were addressing everybody in Japanese, and then they started counting in English.
Right.
And I found that interesting. It's like, why are you counting in English and not in Japanese? I couldn't really understand why. And I thought, is this another one of those potential little connections here?
I do sometimes wonder, and if there's any perhaps either Japanese listeners or perhaps Western expats who live in Japan who are listeners who might know this. See, I've noticed that too in different contexts, like in Japanese sport a lot. I'm thinking specifically of Puro Wrestling, Japanese professional wrestling. The counts will be in English. You ever watch like New Japan or older All Japan or Pro Wrestling Noah? Anytime somebody's out of the ring, they actually do the count over the PA so that you can actually hear the count. And they will count in, it's obviously it's accented, but they'll count in English. They'll do they'll lay the 20 count on them in English. I actually was lucky enough to see New Japan in Charlotte, North Carolina. And they did it there too. They counted in English. All the ring announcement and everything else was in Japanese, but they actually counted in English. So I wonder if that's just a cultural thing, maybe in certain contexts. There is, especially again, by this point in 1959, there was a fair amount of crossover of English specifically, but Western words in general being adopted into Japanese, where they would just take the word and sound it out phonetically.
Yeah, well, and there was some of the Japanese characters in this were saying some things in English here and there, but it's because I think it was because they had Americans there with them, and the Americans would say stuff in English, which I was trying to figure out, because most of the time it sounded like the Americans were dubbed into Japanese, but then they let some English words keep going anyway. Right. So I was just like, wonder how was that in the script, or was that some sort of decision they made in post about letting some of the words stay in English or something? I don't know. I would be curious to find out about that. But going back to the Natal, the other thing that I find interesting about this is that they're relatively, I would say, undeveloped. We don't really know what their full motivations are. They're presented as this faceless enemy for most of the movie. We never really get to see, which is also different compared to the other alien races that we'll see from Toho. Even the Mysterians. We saw the Mysterians. We didn't see their faces because they all wore helmets, but we saw them. And we see the Zillions, the Exians, however you want to say it. We saw the Disco Space Nuns. We saw the Nebulans in Gigan. We saw the Simians in the Mechagodzilla films. We see all of them, but we don't really see them in this. We see their ships and we hear them talk for most of the movie. And actually, you were talking about how they sounded like the aliens from Earth versus the Flying Saucer. Did you ever see the British television show Captain Scarlet?
I have seen a little bit of Captain Scarlet, so the Mysterons are the
that was
aliens
what I was
thinking
one. Of the Mysterons. So it was because the voice sounded very similar. Like, this is the voice of the Mysterons. I had some flashbacks to that.
Shout out to a colleague of mine, Mr. Andy Leyland. He does his show, The Palace of Glittering Delights, and he did a whole episode on Captain Scarlet. He's a big Jerry Anderson fan, so shout out to him.
Yeah, but anyway, as I was saying, so they're this faceless enemy, and it seems like their primary tool in this film is intimidation. They want to scare people. That's why they keep broadcasting threats to everybody all the time. And I wonder, because the one time we potentially see them, because I'm still not 100% sure, because they never really say one way or the other, but when we see those creepy little imps accosting our poor heroine, I think it was Etsuko. I want to say it was Etsuko.
Etsuko.
Yeah.
Yep.
Accosting her with their funny little squeaks and everything. That's the closest we get to seeing it, is seeing them and we don't even know. But I was thinking to myself, if that's really what they look like, maybe that's why their first tactic is intimidation with the big booming voice and it's deep and everything. It's because they're trying to scare the humans away because technologically they can handle them. We know their ships can do all kinds of crazy things. They can best us technologically, but they know if they ever got into a physical confrontation, they would be in trouble.
Totally. I can definitely see that. And you're right. Of all the alien races, they are the least developed. And it's very telling. But at the same time, their technology, we get quite a lot of. And we become familiar with the type of weapons and ships that they have at their disposal. There's a whole discussion in the UN about how they're able to create anti-gravity beams, basically.
Yes.
I'm not sure that is scientifically accurate, but sure, I'm willing to buy it. That at absolute zero, gravity reverses. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's cool. Jimmy, any thoughts on that? I mean, you've done a lot of research. You have anything on that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, you were saying that to me, Jimmy, when we watched this before you came here, Luke. He loves this movie, but he says the science in it drives him crazy.
yeah.
Because he says a lot of it really doesn't make sense. Like apparently gravity works through the motion of atoms. I think that's what they said. Let me check my notes. I wrote that down because I actually wrote down about it. It's like I'm not familiar with that theory of gravity.
Yeah, and apparently gravity it only doesn't work if you don't pay attention. Then it's otherwise it's. No, I mean, I don't remember that from when I was taking my engineering classes either. But again, one could then possibly, if one wants to think in those...
Yeah, it's caused by the motion of atoms, and it ceases at absolute zero, which is why they were freezing everything.
Yeah.
Which is a little bit crazy to begin with, because that's more of a science fictional concept, because I remember asking about that when I was taking physical science in my undergrad days. Absolute zero is only theoretically possible. I think it is considered scientifically impossible to actually reach absolute zero, where atoms and molecules and everything just stop moving.
Right.
I mean, it would be interesting to find out if that... I mean, I don't know. No one really knows, as far as I know, really knows how gravity works anyway. So you can make up whatever you want. But although speaking of gravity, that was the other thing you said, it only works when you're paying attention. I love how they at least, when we get into space, they at least acknowledge that there's weightlessness in space. I mean, this is 1959. This movie was certainly inspired by the space race. In fact, I've read that the whole thing actually got started because Tsuburaya went to the right people at Toho, maybe it was Honda, I'm not quite sure, and said, hey, we need to do a moon landing movie because that's going to be a thing. Because this was made right at the beginning of the space race when things were going crazy. And like I said, I'll explain a little bit more about that later. But they at least acknowledge that there's weightlessness in space, but it's only in that Sekizawa sort of humor. There's that touch of Sekizawa's in here with the occasional jokes that are in here. So that one guy takes his seatbelt off after they've finished the launch, and he floats up and bonks his head, and then they have to pull him down. And that's the only acknowledgement of weightlessness that they ever make. Because other than that, they just like, oh yeah, there's no gravity in space. And then for the rest of the movie, we're going to walk around like we have gravity.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was like, guys, if you're going to acknowledge it right at the beginning, that sets up an expectation. I mean, I'm glad you acknowledged it, but dang, man. I mean, Monster Zero actually got around it by just every time you saw any of the characters in the Earth spacecraft, they always had seatbelts on. So you didn't have to worry about it.
Yeah.
See, but then when they're on the Zillion ships, they're walking around like they have gravity. But like you can accept that because it's alien technology. We'll just assume that they have artificial gravity.
Well, I mean, they're able to negate the gravity of Godzilla and Rodan to carry them in a bubble of force all the way across space, out of Lake Ashino, and not Washigasara. So that makes sense. Did you know the thing with the idea that Natal trying to be intimidating and having their big machines and speaking with loud voices? If one is so inclined, you can extend Barr's theory to that, right? The idea that the Americans were coming in and were being, they had the biggest guns and the biggest bombs and the fastest ships. And I don't want to speculate too much on that, but perhaps that was part of it, this idea that they were coming in and bullying and pushing people around.
Yeah.
I'm sure that there's some people that probably think that that's an accurate depiction. Again, I'm not trying to put words in Sekazawa's mouth, but I could see
for that matter. But
right.
But I do think that theory is undone by the fact. It's the same reason why I don't buy it in Monster Zero. Hey, calm down, Jimmy. I know how much you love Glenn and Nick Adams. So, that's enough.
Yes.
You can do the Shay dance in silence over there, okay? But it's undone by the fact that in Monster Zero, if we take that theory to its logical conclusion, okay, we'll say the Zillions are an anti-American commentary. But one of the heroes of the movie is an American, and his best friend is Japanese. And yeah, she turns out to be an alien spy, but it's a Japanese actress, and he's in a relationship with her, a romantic relationship, and it's presented as positive. In fact, they actually get to kiss, which you never see in a Godzilla movie. So,
yeah. Well, no,
so it's undone by that, and I think it's
I'm
undone to a certain extent in this because we have a lot of Americans working with the Japanese to combat the invaders here.
Right. Again, it goes back to, like was established in the Mysterians, this idea of Japan as a modern country who is part of the international community and, is willing to play nicely with others and put the good of the many ahead of their own personal desires. It really does present that international, almost globalist sort of view in a positive light, and it works out for them. They have a mixed team on the mission. The mission ultimately is a success despite the many setbacks that they have to deal with. And then when the Natal counterattack, yes, they suffer some major blows, but in the end, it's a cooperative effort and they repel the attack, and it's a happy ending for all the nations of the world. Again, there's a line very specifically when they're building the SPIPs or SPIPs. They put over Japan that they couldn't do this without that. I think it's Professor Adachi says, well, it was the effort of many nations that led us to this point. Not say, it's like, again, you've got a country that was during the peak, and you talked about this on your Half Human episode, about the idea of fanaticism and that fanatical devotion, fanatical nationalism during the war, to the point that in the post-war period, nationalism became that was a no-no. You did not talk about nationalism in a positive way in Japan.
No, you didn't.
For at least 40 years. The first time really that you see this reflected in, at least in the, to keep it in context, I mean, really the first time you see nationalism really reflected positively is in Godzilla versus Biollante, which is 1989. So that's decades after this. So, this goes towards, again, the general presentation of Japan in not just, primarily in the tokusatsu, the science fiction movies, this idea that they were a country that was mature and part of the international community and wanted to play well with others. And that's why I think that even though the invaders may take on certain ones of these qualities, I agree with you. The fact that they are shown almost always to be friendly with America, to the point that in Return of Godzilla, when the Prime Minister has to stand up to America and the Soviet Union, that's, capital B, capital D, big deal.
Oh, yes.
The idea that Japan has to say, no, we can't allow this. That was a break from the way that the Showa movies typically were presented.
Yeah. I'm going to make this connection because you went here. I have actually heard another podcast that connected this film and its themes of international cooperation with Shin Godzilla, which I find a little bit astonishing because the similar thing like you were talking about with Return of Godzilla happens. Japan tells the United States no for the same thing. They said, we need to nuke this thing, and Japan says, no, you're not. We're going to find another solution. The funny thing is that this other podcast took issue with the fact that the Japanese prime minister or the Japanese government in this were telling the United States no because they thought it was betraying what Honda was always trying to do with the Showa era films. And they directly connected Shin Godzilla to Battle in Outer Space with some of the oddest reasoning, which was that when you get to the government conference scenes in this film, you see all the flags of the United Nations represented, but in Shin Godzilla, you only ever see the Japanese flag in any of the government buildings. And my first thought was, that's because those are Japanese government buildings. Why would they have flags for other countries in their government buildings? That would be weird. And this is the UN. Of course they would have the flags for all the member nations there. I mean, I visited Congress. I would find it strange if I went to Congress and, I don't know, they had the Canadian flag sitting next to the United States flag in there. It just seems strange to me. But still, a similar thing is happening. And what I think a lot of people who adhere to that when it comes to Shin Godzilla miss out is that there are lines, just like in this movie, talking about international cooperation and how everything that happens in that movie comes about because of international cooperation. Because there are several other nations, including the United States, that help the Japanese deal with the Godzilla crisis in that.
I mean, getting even beyond all the themes of, like I said, the themes of cooperation, the themes of internationalism. You know why this movie really succeeds for me is that it's spectacle. This is such a spectacular movie. I mean, even the scenes that don't seem like they should be spectacle look just so wonderful. There's a certain scene where they've landed on the moon. And first off, when they land on the moon, we get the Spips are VTOLs, right? And so there's these big rocket ships that are coming down like a vertical takeoff and landing. It's like, P1. Oh, P1. Excuse me. Oh, sorry.
Jimmy's jumping up and down in his producer booth right now. He loves that. And that's like the one ship he hasn't been able to get in his garage. No one will let him have it.
The P1 is so boss, isn't it? It's so cool. But that shot of them coming down and landing looks exactly the way that Honda shot the same scenes in Monster Zero.
Yes.
But once the recon team is out, we get a shot. It's a composite shot where we have the cast walking and they're behind a little bit of rocky set. And then there's this beautiful matte painting behind them that is printed behind them.
Matte paintings.
And it's like,
matte paintings are a lost art.
Yeah.
I know you can make the argument that they just do the same thing in computers, but it's just not quite the same.
It doesn't have the warmth. But just that whole, and even a little before that, you mentioned Barr's book, the kaiju film. He makes the argument in that I agree with completely, is that Eastern filmmakers were less interested in depicting realism than they were in depicting something that was a memorable or striking image.
Yes.
And the scenes in space, I'm thinking specifically where they first fly the Spips launch and we get the debris from the remains of the space station. It's kind of creepy, but it is visually arresting with the debris, including human body floating in space.
Oh, man. That actually was a little bit gruesome, and if you stop and think about it. That's probably the most somber moment, the most emotionally affecting moment. Well, one of them. I would say that, and when Iwamura dies later. Those are probably the two most emotionally effective scenes, and they say a prayer for everybody. For a movie that is high on plot and a little bit thin on character, this was a moment where the movie actually stopped and had a little moment to give us a little bit more gravitas with what's going on. Yes. And from what I've read, that scene was something that Honda was particularly interested in because of his war experience, that he thought something should be done, even if just a small moment to acknowledge the people who died in this attack by the Natal. And I think it was a good move on his part.
Yeah.
But, oh my gosh, man, the effects in this movie. I'm gonna just say this right now, and Jimmy will really appreciate this. I would bet money George Lucas saw this movie.
Oh yeah,
he saw this. For one thing, the Natal's helmets look like the Endor stormtroopers in Return of the Jedi. But when the climax, especially with that huge space battle, when the Natal mothership is coming. And the Earth rocket fighters are fighting the Natal fighters in orbit of Earth and all of that. And I'm just like, this is Star Wars, man. This is Star Wars. That's the thing. Stuart Galbraith mentioned this in his book. Much of the same thing that you're talking about. This movie succeeds because of its showmanship.
Right.
And it wants to throw striking visual images at you. And my gosh, I know that they had to cut some corners with the budget. They had intended to make this a bit more of an ambitious movie. But Toho had just changed ownership at this point because the original founder of Toho had actually just died and it was under new ownership, so they had to cut corners with the budget. But my gosh, I was like, really? This is the less ambitious movie that they had? Really?
Right.
What were you going to do?
No,
I mean, there's just so much.
I mean, yeah, but all the, like you said, the base dogfights at the end, where the Natal are hurling the asteroids at them, and they have to shoot down the asteroids. To me, the effects in this hold up better than some Western productions from the 70s. You know, even larger budgeted ones.
That's the astonishing thing.
Yeah. And then really, to me, the most striking visual of all of this film, in a film that is made up of a lot of visuals, when they attack Tokyo.
Oh my gosh.
And they turned the anti-gravity beam on Tokyo. I remember a few years back when I covered Mothra on the podcast, I remember saying, you know, when Mothra tears through Newkirk City, and blows like the hurricane winds blowing the cars all over and smashing it, that it was very striking because it had taken what was done in Rodan and gone a level above that. Here, I mean, you know, in the Mysterians and stuff, we got them causing earthquakes and all that with the Mogra.
Yeah, the
and
tidal
so we do
wave.
get some of that stuff. The tidal wave. This takes that and just turns it up to 11, where they're literally tearing the city apart. And it's incredible. And it blows your mind every time you see it because you're used to seeing the miniatures be destroyed. You're not used to them being thrown about.
No. And when I watched that, I already mentioned, I'm sure George Lucas saw this. You know who else I think saw this movie? Zack Snyder, because that looks just like the alien attack on Metropolis in Man of Steel. I think they even said they're using a gravity weapon, which I thought, well, okay, that's kind of interesting. Yeah. Battle in Outer Space did it 34 years before that movie.
Yeah.
I take it back. My math is off. It's 54 years.
54 years. I was going to say, that didn't sound right, but... Well, and that's the thing. It's like, even in the Godzilla series, where we have a recurring enemy monster whose power is based on gravity with King Ghidorah. His beams are specifically called the gravity beams, with the idea that they locally create disturbances in the gravity that rip things apart. We see this put to very unique effect in Zone Fighter, where he can like levitate things with his gravity beams.
Yeah, I was thinking, it was like, for things called gravity beams, they don't seem to manipulate a whole lot of gravity until you get to Final Wars, then they actually have it move things around with them, which is odd.
Right. But here, again, the gravity weapon, they kind of telegraph it because they have them pick the train bridge up in the beginning of the film using the gravity, which is kind of
trolls. They're such trolls as they pick up the bridge, let the train crash, and then put the bridge right back. Like nothing happened. I'm like, you jerks.
But by that you see that they have actually very fine control over this.
Yes.
Whereas by the end of it, they're like, nope, crank it up and tear off the knobs.
Yep. See those buildings? They are weeds to us. Pull them up.
Yeah. And you do have to love the next in the line of satellite dish style Earth weapons.
I know. That must have been Tsuburaya's thing. He loved weaponized satellites. Yes. They are all over the place. He also, I noticed, was very fond of wavy rays. You know, like almost all the ray guns in this, whether they're giant satellites or the character's personal pistols, they're firing wave beams. I'm like, that's a thing. He loves wavy beams.
And you get a lot of the standard Toho, it's not even Toho, the standard Tsuburaya sound effects.
Yes.
We get the UFO sound, which is one of my favorites. We get the atomic heat ray. It uses the same sound as the Marker Light Cannon and the A-cycle light ray and the Maser and the atomic heat ray from Mothra. They all have the similar sound. Those sounds to me are like comfort food. Those classic Tsuburaya sound effects, when I hear them, they bring me back to my childhood every time. And so hearing them is always a treat. We were talking a little bit before we went on the air about how certain directors of tokusatsu are like the Michael Bay of their time. Well, this is like a Michael Bay movie of its era where we've just got some wanton destruction in widescreen. That's the thing people sometimes don't necessarily give Bay enough credit for, the way that Bay innovated the use of using the IMAX camera to film action, especially in the Transformers films. Here, in Toho scope, in widescreen, this is just incredible looking. The action, and especially the last 20 minutes or so of this film where it's space dogfight and then destruction gork just nonstop is like, yeah, it's all on. To the point that when they resolve the situation, they blow up the mothership. It's like, all right, movie over. Everybody go home.
Yeah, pretty much.
You know?
That was a little odd. I mean, I was sitting there thinking, it's like, you guys realize that there was some pretty nasty destruction in New York, and the Golden Gate Bridge got taken out, and God only knows what the center of Tokyo looks like. And you're just like, oh, aliens defeated. Yay.
Well, that's also kind of a Western sci-fi movie trope.
Yeah, I mean, there was a little bit of silence. Because there was that lingering shot of those hangars that got taken out by a crashed Natal ship.
Yes.
So it was like there was this moment of silence, then they celebrated. Honda lets the camera linger on those hangars. So it's, again, one of those small moments when Honda kind of gets full control and he says, I want to actually have a somber moment here because I went to the war and I know what it's like. So, okay. All right, now we'll celebrate that you beat the aliens. So it's little things like that.
Yeah. So I do want to bring this up real quick, and you did mention this. The cast for this movie, you would think, okay, this is, a big, colorful, spectacular science fiction epic. This would have a lot of familiar faces in it. And it doesn't have the cast that you would think it would. A lot of these are folks that work for Toho, maybe there's a few others tokusatsu credits amongst the cast, but these are a lot of folks that did other non-genre films for Toho. So it's very interesting because it doesn't have Akira Hakarada or any of the other cast members that Akira Kube, that we typically think of for these movies.
Yeah, probably the most recognizable and well-known one in here is Yoshio Tsuchiya. Although I think at this point he wasn't quite as big of a star yet. Mm-hmm. We at least got him because he's the one guy who wasn't in The Three Treasures.
Yeah, well, we got to say there's a few other genre credits. Minoru Takada, who plays the commander, he's in Astragon and he's in Ghidorah, the Three-Headed Monster. He would also go for Tsuburaya. He would appear in Ultra Q and Ultraman. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty neat. What's interesting is just going through the cast, you get obviously the Japanese cast and you get the American cast. At least two members of the American cast, this is their only credit. So did not spin this off into long careers. Now, that said, Harold Conway, who plays Dr. Immerman, he did, in fact, have quite a long career in Japanese film.
Which is ironic because the man was a lawyer.
Yes, not again, but he looked American. He looked like a wise, American. Put a pipe in that man's hand.
Yeah.
But Conway,
he's been in more Toho movies than I'll ever be in. So
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. But he was in The Mysterians. He was in The Last War.
Which, spoiler warning, will be next month's minisode on the show.
Looking forward. Definitely looking forward to that. The Last War is bad. Again, another one that stock footage just kept getting used. He was in King Kong versus Godzilla. He's on the submarine before.
Yeah, where his English speaking acting was apparently so bad that got dubbed over too.
Yeah, that's really something. He's in Mothra versus Godzilla. I want to say he's in the scene that's exclusive to the American version with the American naval attack.
That would make sense.
With the Frontier missiles, I think they're called.
Yes.
And then he would also go on to appear in Ultraman, and then was in Invasion of the Neptune Men.
Oh, that movie. I have only ever seen that on MST3K, and all I'm hearing right now is ha 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 ha. Our costumes are ridiculous.
So a good cast. They do a good job, but not necessarily the Toho regulars you might be picturing if you've never seen the film.
Yeah. I mean, I don't even know if Yoshio Tsuchiya was even that recognizable, because his previous, and I could be wrong, Jimmy may correct me about this in his blog because that's what he do, but Tsuchiya's previous tokusatsu credit that I can think of was the Mysterians, and you didn't see his face. He was wearing a helmet. Because that's what he liked that. People thought it was like, hey, you're the handsome leading man. We don't want you to have that part. It's like, oh, I want this part. I want to be the alien leader. You're going to have to wear a helmet. I don't care.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the guy. Also, Tsuchiya had a reputation for being a bit of an oddball. He was into, like the way I heard it, the best way I think I could describe it is, the UFO club leader in Ghidorah, the three-headed monster. Mm-hmm. Like, apparently that was Tsuchiya in real life. He was into that kind of stuff. Like, he was probably the guy, if there was a Japanese version of Coast to Coast AM, he'd be up late listening to it. That kind of thing. He was actually advocating when they were making the movie. He said, when we get to the moon, we need to step lightly because the moon has lower gravity. And I guess the cast was embarrassed. Like, really? They were embarrassed to do that. But they did it anyway because he said this is what we should do. Guess what? 10 years later, he got vindicated. I hope he called Honda up on the phone when the moon landing was getting broadcast out to the whole world. I hope he called them up and said, hey, see, I was right in Battle in Outer Space. I was right, dang it.
I'm sure it was foremost in his mind.
See, Jimmy's in total agreement with me.
Yes.
He had some issues with the science there, but he was happy with that. Although, speaking of that, I mentioned before this was made at the height of the beginning of the space race. I do want to bring up a few things related to the space race in conjunction with that. Obviously, as a lot of us, particularly of the geek variety, we all know that the space race essentially got started with the launch of Sputnik, which was actually only 2 years before this movie, October 4th, 1957. The first artificial satellite, first man-made object to be placed in Earth's orbit. That was a gigantic accomplishment. And to say that the Americans were not happy about that would be an understatement.
Right.
Oh man. They were not happy. In fact, a year later, 1958, the Americans did actually catch up with them. They launched Explorer 1, which was their own satellite under the direction of a rocket scientist. This is what it actually says in my notes from where I got this. A rocket scientist named Werner von Braun. So it's probably another one of those German fellows who got brought over to the United States because they said, hey, you helped the Nazis, but we like how smart you are, so come over here.
Yeah. Well, it's that was Project Paperclip, right? That was how we caught up in the space races. All those German rocket scientists that suddenly found themselves across the Atlantic. It's crazy when you think about Sputnik from a pop culture standpoint. It was a sea change. Once Sputnik went up, the fascination with space in popular culture just exploded. I'm reminded in Toy Story 2, the prospector says that he hates space toys because suddenly Sputnik went up and nobody wanted to play with cowboys anymore. It was always spacemen.
Yeah, and that's why I think in this movie you have that huge send-off for the astronauts in this. It's because at that point, astronauts were quickly becoming rock stars. I think it really becomes the case in the 60s in the United States, but I think you got the first inklings of it here. They were the new cowboys, exploring, as they say in Star Trek, the final frontier.
The final frontier.
Yes.
The other one, there's a line in this too where it's Etsuko. She's out with, I guess she's with Katsumiya, isn't she? When they're out before the mission, when they're out on
another one of those rare emotionally touching scenes, I will say.
Yeah. Well, they're talking about how things are moving forward, and Etsuko is talking about the myth about the moon, the Japanese myth. And the line is that fantasies are starting to vanish from our world.
Yes.
And I think it's funny, first off, in a movie that leans so heavily into science fiction that they're talking about fantasy going away. The same year that they're making The Three Treasures, which is, I mean, that is the myth of the creation of Japan.
Oh my gosh.
That is, you know, a legendary story of fantasy. It's being a little bit forward looking that science fiction is going to be what's carrying the day. As we advance in our scientific knowledge, fantasies are going to seem quaint. And one could almost, and again, 15 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, one could almost make the connection in a negative connotation that the horrors of the real world, the horrors of science, will outpace fantasy very quickly.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's the connotation, but looking at it in retrospect, that becomes clear. The idea of yokai and dragons seem pretty tame compared to the horrors that man creates on his own.
Yeah, hence why Ghidorah, the three-headed golden dragon, is from outer space. Kind of
exactly
bridging the two of them there, I think.
Right. He's a space monster. The concept of a space monster doesn't really exist. What we would call the air quotes up to the mic Earth monsters, that's just monsters at this point.
Yeah.
You know, the space monster doesn't come until we get a few years later.
Yep. Yes, Jimmy, I'm getting to that. This is what happens when you let your producer look at your notes beforehand. Because he's reminding me that, yes, the same year that Explorer 1 was launched was also the year that President Eisenhower created his original place of employment, NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, which was a federal agency dedicated to space exploration. Ya happy now? Thank you.
Hey, you know, not everybody knows somebody that worked at NASA, so it's something to be proud of.
That is true. Although you should see the things he tweets about on there. You know, he follows all the NASA Twitter feeds, and he's always like, did you guys forget that I built the Goten?
Yeah, you don't see the Goten too much in their retrospectives anymore. I guess it's kind of fallen out of favor.
Yeah. He has a beef with them because of that. Anyway, Eisenhower also created a pair of national security-oriented space programs to operate simultaneously with NASA, and the first actually was looking into the military potential of space, which I guess finally came to fruition because we now have a space force.
Right. Well, that's always been that. Even in my childhood, in growing up in Reagan's America, Star Wars, you know.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Or even just the concept of an ICBM, you know, that's low orbit. In these trying times we live in, I think fondly on my youth when all I had to worry about was nuclear annihilation, you know. So...
Tweet that.
Yeah. Hey, the truth hurts sometimes, but
yeah, you can get away with saying that. I barely remember anything from the Cold War. I was in grade school.
Man.
I'm dating myself a little bit. I was in grade school when the Cold War ended. I don't even remember hearing anything about the Berlin Wall. That's how young I was.
Yeah, well, I'm not so old that I had duck and cover drills, but I am old enough to remember basically worrying about that. I remember being old enough to really be concerned about that, especially after watching Godzilla in 1985. But
yeah. Yeah, but then as I was saying, there was a second organization that was actually run by the CIA.
That seems like a good idea.
Yeah, it was called the National Reconnaissance Office, and it was classified until the 1990s. And guess what? It was codenamed.
What was the code name?
Corona.
Oh no! Oh no! We can't know.
And it would use orbiting satellites to gather intelligence on the Soviet Union.
Well, you know, that at least makes sense. But it's rare that we develop a new technology without immediately thinking of how can we use this to more efficiently blow up a small portion of our world.
Yep.
That's just kind of the way it goes, you know.
But, here's something else for you. Before they managed to succeed with Explorer 1, Eisenhower ordered this thing called Project Vanguard to move up their timetable after Sputnik went up. So they launched that December 6, 1957, and it was a horrible failure at Cape Canaveral. But here's, you know what made it even worse? It was broadcast live on TV.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
It exploded just a few seconds after it was launched, and it became an international joke. For what I read online, the newspapers came up with all kinds of funny nicknames for it. The best ones being Flopnik, Stay Putnik, and Kaputnik, and Dudnik.
Kaputnik. Well, luckily we were able to move past that. And,
yeah, not one of the shining moments in the history of U.S. space exploration.
No. Nope.
But, like I said, eventually they got over that. And here's something I found interesting. We've spent all this time talking about, the space race was this big thing. It was another front, I guess you could say, on the Cold War. That's what it really boiled down to. The space race was another aspect of the Cold War. It got ramped up in the 60s when you had President Kennedy giving that rousing speech about how we're going to put a man on the moon before the end of the decade. And this was at a time when the Russians beat the United States to another important milestone because they were the first country to launch a man into space. So that was a big deal. And so then it became, we need to get to the moon before the Soviets do. And they managed to do that. So, like I said, it became another aspect of the Cold War. So we're talking about how this fueled battle in outer space, but I found out Japan also has a space agency.
Yes.
Yeah, it's called JAXA, JAXA. Now, they're a more recent agency. It stands for Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency. You see what they did there? They wanted to be funny. They must have really wanted that X, so they kind of cheated a little bit with exploration. And they were actually formed October 1st, 2003. However, this was created through the merger of 3 other organizations, 2 of which actually existed at the time that Battle in Outer Space was made and released. One was called ISAS, ISAS, and they were responsible for space and planetary research. And then you had NAL, which did aviation research. And then there was another organization called NASDA, NASDA, and they were started October 1st, 1969, and then all 3 of them combined together into JAXA. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So yes, there is an equivalent to NASA in Japan. Why didn't you work there, Jimmy? They wouldn't take you? Don't you have Japanese friends who could help you with that? Oh, never mind. Background's convoluted enough as it is. I'm not even going to try to unravel that.
Now, of course, NASDA should not be confused with NASADA, which is who built the Astro Megaship 1.
Yes.
What was that called in Japan? The Mega Winger? No, that was the second one. Whatever the Megaship. Don't confuse those 2 agencies.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. The thing of it is, though, is the actual founder, I guess you could say, of Japanese space exploration was actually a Tokyo University professor named Hideo Itokawa. He established an aviation research group at the Institute of Industrial Science at the University of Tokyo. Now, that sounds about as engineerish as you could possibly get. Yeah. I should know. I've hung out with them, but I went to a university for my grad school that was big on the sciences. So that definitely sounds right up there. And he made what was called a pencil rocket on April 12, 1955. And that became kind of the prototype for Japanese rocketry after that. That just kept getting bigger and bigger. Eventually led to other things like you had the baby rocket. They must love these funny names. They had the baby rocket, which got to an altitude of 6 kilometers or 3.7 miles. And then after the baby rocket, you had the Raccoon rocket. And then one of the ones I think for kaiju fans, this would be noteworthy, the Kappa rocket.
Well, it's not the Death Kappa rocket.
We're not going there. That's a movie I don't know if we'll ever be on the show, but we'll maybe. And this rocket was actually used for weather observation and data collection in 1958, so just the year before the movie.
Yeah, so even for the countries that were not ostensibly part of the space race, that was a driver of popular culture, and that's what was taking the reins. So for Toho to make a couple of alien invasion films within a few years of each other, makes perfect sense. To continue to introduce more space elements going forward into the next decade.
Yeah, you can see it start to ramp up even more as the 60s progressed and the space race accelerated. Right. I mean, it culminated with the film that you just covered on your show, actually. All Monsters Attack. They have a scene where Ichiro goes into his apartment, and what's on TV? The moon landing.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, but it's in fact, there's even a prophetic line of sorts in this film when our heroes are leaving the moon. Someone actually remarks, "We'll go back."
We'll go back.
I mean, and which was true both in real life and in Toho's films, because yes, 10 years later, we did send a man to the moon, and then 30 years after that, the disco space nuns decided to set up a base there.
Oh, man. You wonder if they use the same, if they're like, hey, you remember the Natal were here? Maybe they left some of their stuff, you know?
I would not be surprised. Yeah.
I mean, you've already flown all the way across the galaxy. You might want to save a few bucks. I don't know. But anyway.
Yeah.
Anyway.
All right. Well, that covers pretty much everything that I was going to bring up for this film, and whatever I didn't will be given to Jimmy for his blog. So unless you've got anything, this seems like a good place to wrap things up.
Yeah, I mean, no, like I said, it's just this movie is finally out there. I say finally. This movie is out there now for public consumption here in the West. And if you've never seen it, give it a shot. It is a fun, enjoyable space opera that really puts the emphasis on the visuals, and it really pays off. And I, for one, I love that DVD, that Icons of Sci-Fi DVD. Very much looking forward to see what Mill Creek does on Blu-ray with this movie. Yeah. Because this is definitely, as I said earlier, a spectacle film. So watch it on the biggest TV you can find.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Although, I got to say, I'm pretty happy with the setup I have in the screening room here. It's gotten high mark. My co-hosts have given it high marks, let's just say.
It's pretty swank, man.
Yeah. All right. Well, an episode of the Monster Island Film Vault would not be complete without some shameless self-promotion. Take it away, Luke.
No podcast is complete without a little shameless self-promotion. That's why we're here. It's like podcast promotion. They kind of go back and forth. So
we all have to promote each other, man.
That's right. That's right, man. Hey, you just had a promo on a very recent episode of my main podcast. If you're not sick and tired of hearing my voice and you'd like to hear some more of me talking about giant monsters, you can check out my show, which is Earth Destruction Directive, a kaiju podcast covering all aspects of Japanese giant monster culture. I've been running that show for a little over 9 years, and I've always have fun trying to get it out monthly. That can be found at twotruefreaks.com. That's TWOTRUEFREAKS.com. I also am one of the hosts on The Vault of Startling Monster Horror Tales of Terror, which is a horror-themed podcast, primarily horror film, but we do some other horror as well. I co-host that with my brother, Jason Jaconetti, Two True Freaks OG, Chris Honeywell, and the hair metal hero, Chris Tyler. And I finally also am a host on Get Back to the Wrestling. Finally, there is a podcast on the internet about professional wrestling. I co-host that with my brother, Jay, and the hair metal hero. Those two can also be found at twotruefreaks.com. So if any of those sound interesting, please check them out. I'd really appreciate if you could give them a listen.
All right. 9 years, man. So you and Kyle Yount are like the, for lack of a better way to put it, you're like the old patriarchs of kaiju podcasting now. You know, we're all following in your shoes.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm pretty, I don't have quite the output that Kyle did, but you know, it's weird. I was looking back on it because I was looking over my notes like, yeah, it started, I said about 9 years ago. And it's like, wow, it's hard to believe that it's been quite that long, but it's been a long, strange trip, and hopefully we'll keep Earth Destruction Directive going and be part of this kind of new burst we've gotten of daikaiju and Japanese monster-related podcasts on the internet that I'm a very exciting time to be a daikaiju fan for sure.
Yes, it is. And I've been very happy with the community that a lot of these podcasters have been building with each other. It's been wonderful. Getting to know you and all the other guys. Finally, like I'm amongst you now.
Well, you're more than welcome. The Monster Island Film Vault is a very fun show. Always look forward to it each month. I'm glad that you feel that way. I mean, this community, a lot of fandoms have been getting kind of a bum rap over the last few years, maybe well-deserved raps, but I think we can help make the daikaiju fandom as best as it can be.
Yeah, as you frequently say on your show, Earth Destruction Directive is for everyone, and I recently said the same thing about my show. All are welcome here on Monster Island, so long as you don't have Corona. That's the one exception we're making right now.
Yeah, right. And that's probably for the best.
All right. Well, thank you once again, Luke, for stopping by. You are more than welcome to return, like I said, barring any Corona infections.
Again, thank you very much for having me. Thank you, Jimmy, for getting me safely on the island. We'll talk off air about where exactly I got to go to get off of this island. We'll figure that out. Maybe I got to hang out here for a couple of weeks. I don't know what the board of directors is going to do. It seems to change on an hourly basis. So just kind of play it by ear, I guess. Well, hey, man, hey, whatever we got to do, I'm game. I don't mind. I haven't been to Malaysia in a long time. So, hey, you want to do that? That works, man.
That'll be an interesting trip. You're gonna have to, find an alternate route to get back to the States. It may have to be the scenic route.
Yeah, as long as we're not taking that Pteranodon flyer, I think we'll be okay. That.
I think I put the kibosh on that one. Oh, poor Danny.
Yeah.
Although he got a Patreon supporter out of it, so.
Hey, you know what? It all works out in the end, right? So.
Yeah. But next time, hopefully, the resort will be open so you can enjoy that a little bit too.
Sweet.
Hi, listeners. If this sounds like it's lower quality, it's because it is. I realized that I forgot to mention what our next episodes were going to be when I recorded with Luke. So really quick, our next episode will be Rebirth of Mothra, featuring Bex from the Redeemed Otaku podcast. And as I mentioned earlier this episode, next month's minisode will be The Last War from 1961. Now, back to the show. All right. Thanks a lot again, man. All right, Jimmy, cue credits. Thank you for listening to the Monster Island Film Vault, a podcast produced and hosted by Nathan Marchand. If you enjoy the show and want to join the discussion, we'd love to hear from you. So email us at feedback@monsterislandfilmvault.com. Your message could be read on a future episode of the show. Our website is monsterislandfilmvault.com. Follow us on Facebook at Monster Island Film Vault and on Twitter, where our handle is The Monster Isla 1. You can also follow Jimmy from NASA on Twitter at NASAJimmy. I have fulfilled my contractual obligations. The podcast logo was created by Tyler Souls from TylerDrawsComics.com. Our theme song is Wander on the Offensive, live edit by B33J, Sarax, Juan Madrano, and Nonsensical Lexus, which is a remix of Counterattack, Battle with the Colossus, and The Open Way, Battle with the Colossus by Ko Otani from the video game Shadow of the Colossus. It can be downloaded from ocremix.org. All film and audio clips belong to their respective copyright holders, and no infringement is intended or implied. The show is available on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, YouTube, and other fine podcatchers. Please rate and review the podcast to help spread the word about the show. The Monster Island Film Vault is a Moonlighting Ninjas media production. Sayonara!